July 9, 1943. The skies over Sicily. Private First Class Charles Doyle looked out the door of his C-47 transport aircraft at the darkness below and saw nothing that corresponded to anything on his briefing maps. He was supposed to be over the drop zone near Gela on the southern coast of Sicily, a cleared area of farmland that the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment had marked on aerial photographs and studied for weeks. He was supposed to jump with his stick of 18 paratroopers and land in a specific field at a specific time with specific objectives that had been rehearsed until every man in his unit could execute them in the dark. He was in the dark. He was not over the drop zone. The wind that had been forecast as negligible had strengthened to 40 miles per hour as the C-47 formation crossed the Mediterranean, scattering the aircraft and the men inside them across a band of Sicily 60 miles wide. Navigation that had been adequate in training conditions was inadequate against winds that exceeded every planning assumption. Drop zones that pilots had identified on aerial photographs looked nothing like the actual terrain below them in darkness and confusion. Doyle jumped anyway. All the paratroopers jumped anyway. They jumped because that was what you did when the green light came on, and the green lights were coming on all over Sicily because pilots who were not sure where they were still had to get the men out of the aircraft before the aircraft reached the coast and turned back toward North Africa. What happened next was one of the most consequential accidents in the history of American airborne warfare. The 82nd Airborne Division's jump into Sicily on the night of July 9th to 10th, 1943 was the largest American airborne operation to that date and a tactical disaster by almost every measurable standard of what an airborne operation was supposed to accomplish. The drop zones were missed. Units were scattered across an area 20 times the size of the intended drop zone. Communication between units was impossible because the units were too far apart. The planned seizure of specific objectives by specific units at specific times was not achievable because the units were nowhere near their objectives. What was achieved was something that the planning had not specified, and that the outcome would demonstrate was more valuable than the planned operation would have been. Approximately 5,300 American paratroopers were scattered across the interior of Sicily in small groups ranging from 2 or 3 men to company-sized elements, appearing from the sky in places where the Axis defenders had not expected paratroopers and could not know how many there were or where the next group would appear. The Axis defensive plan had been built around the expectation that the Allied landing would come from the sea and that whatever airborne forces were involved would land in concentrated drops on specific objectives. Instead, the entire interior of Sicily appeared to be full of American paratroopers who were attacking from every direction simultaneously. The psychological impact on the Italian and German forces defending the island was immediate and disproportionate to the actual numbers of Americans involved. Small groups of paratroopers that were objectively insufficient to threaten a defended position were causing local commanders to report large-scale airborne landings in their sectors, each one requesting reserves to deal with what appeared to be a major threat. The reserves that should have been positioned to counterattack the beach landings were instead being scattered to deal with what was actually a few dozen paratroopers behind a farmhouse in the hills. General Alfredo Gazzoni, commanding the Italian Sixth Army that was responsible for Sicily's defense, spent the critical first hours of the Allied invasion responding to reports of paratrooper landings that were accurate in their basic facts and misleading in their implied scale. The report said paratroopers, and Gazzoni knew paratroopers meant a major operation, and his response was calibrated to a major operation that his available information suggested was much larger than it actually was. The individual paratroopers and small groups who were creating this impression were not executing a coordinated deception operation. They were doing what American paratroopers had been trained to do when they found themselves alone in enemy territory, attacking everything that presented an opportunity, moving toward the sound of other fighting, using the initiative that airborne training specifically developed because airborne operations always produce some degree of scatter, and the men who landed in the wrong place needed to be capable of accomplishing something useful without orders from above. Private First Class Doyle landed in an olive grove 2 miles from his drop zone, with 3 other paratroopers from his stick and 7 from a completely different unit. They did not know where they were. They had a compass and a general understanding of which direction the beaches were. They had weapons and ammunition and the training that the 82nd Airborne had been developing for 2 years. They attacked an Italian artillery position that they found in the darkness, captured the guns, and spent the rest of the night moving toward the sound of fighting. By morning, they had linked up with another group of paratroopers, and by the afternoon of July 10th they were with their battalion, which had assembled itself from scattered sticks throughout the morning. What Doyle experienced was representative of what the scattered paratroopers were doing across Sicily in those critical hours. Staff Sergeant Bill Dunfee of the 505th PIR found himself alone after landing, walked 2 miles through enemy-held territory, found an Italian army camp, decided that attacking it would require more ammunition than he had, and walked around it to rejoin American forces. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Gorham assembled 40 paratroopers from 4 different units and attacked and held a ridgeline that controlled the road to Jella until the beach landing forces could advance and relieve him. He was killed in the fighting, but the ridgeline held. Colonel James Gavin, commanding the 505th PIR, landed miles from his drop zone with a small group of men and immediately began moving toward the beach, collecting paratroopers as he went and organizing them into a fighting force that ended the day with control of key terrain features that significantly complicated the German counterattack against the Jella beachhead. The German counterattack against the Jella beachhead on July 10th and 11th was the most dangerous moment of the Sicily invasion, when Hermann Goering Panzer Division tanks reached within yards of the beach before being stopped by naval gunfire and by the infantry of the 1st Infantry Division fighting with the desperate intensity of men who understood that the alternative to holding was being driven back into the sea. The role of the scattered paratroopers in stopping the counterattack was not what it would have been if the drop had gone according to plan, because the plan had called for concentrated paratroopers to block the roads through which the counterattack would move. What the scattered paratroopers actually contributed was different, and in some ways more valuable. They were behind the Panzer Division as it moved toward the beaches, disrupting its supply and communication lines, creating the ambiguous threat picture that made the German commander uncertain whether he was advancing into a prepared position or into a trap. German commanders who were accustomed to assessing the threat posed by airborne forces based on the concentration of the drop had no framework for evaluating a drop that had scattered paratroopers across 60 miles of countryside. The uncertainty that this produced was itself a tactical advantage that no planning document had specified. The second major airborne operation of the Sicily campaign was worse than the first in its immediate tactical results, and has been described as the most tragic friendly fire incident of the American airborne's history. On the night of July 11th, the 504th PIR was flown from North Africa to reinforce the beachhead, following a designated flight path that had been communicated to all Allied naval and ground forces. The communication had not reached every unit. Ships whose lookouts saw aircraft approaching at night over the beachhead, where German aircraft had been bombing with increasing frequency, opened fire. The aircraft that were shot down were American. The men killed were American paratroopers from the 504th PIR. Of the 144 aircraft that flew the mission, 23 were shot down and 37 were damaged. More than 400 paratroopers were killed or wounded in the friendly fire. It was the worst loss the American airborne had experienced, and it was inflicted not by the enemy but by the Allied forces that were supposed to receive the reinforcement. The investigation that followed the friendly fire incident produced recommendations that transformed the planning and execution of subsequent airborne operations. The lesson was not that airborne reinforcement of beachheads was inherently too dangerous to attempt, but that the coordination procedures that needed to exist between airborne aircraft and the surface forces over whose positions they would fly had not been adequately developed or enforced. These lessons were applied at Normandy and at Market Garden and at every subsequent major airborne operation, and the improvements in coordination procedures that resulted from the Sicily experience directly reduced the friendly fire casualties in those later operations. The Sicily campaign as a whole lasted 38 days and ended with the capture of Messina on August 17th, the same day that Patton's 7th Army arrived to find British forces who had arrived hours earlier. The Axis forces that had been defending the island had largely been evacuated to the Italian mainland in the preceding days, a withdrawal that the Allied command had not moved quickly enough to prevent. But the campaign had accomplished what it needed to accomplish. Sicily was taken. The invasion of Italy could proceed from Sicilian bases. Mussolini's government fell during the campaign, replaced by the Badoglio government that would eventually seek terms with the Allies. The German forces that had been committed to Sicily's defense had suffered casualties and had been forced to fight on terms that the American and British forces chose rather than terms that the Axis forces preferred. The 82nd Airborne Division that had scattered across Sicily on the night of July 9th emerged from the campaign as a fundamentally different organization from the one that had boarded the C-47s in North Africa. Not fundamentally different in its personnel, who were largely the same people who had jumped into the Sicilian darkness. Fundamentally different in its understanding of what airborne warfare actually required and what individual paratroopers actually needed to be capable of when the drop went wrong, which it almost always did in some degree. The men who had landed alone in olive groves and farmyards across Sicily and had attacked Italian artillery positions and walked around Italian army camps and assembled themselves into fighting forces from the scattered sticks of half a dozen different units had learned something that could not be taught in training and could not be simulated in exercises. They had learned what they were capable of when there was no one to tell them what to do. The answer was more than anyone had expected. The scatter that had been a tactical failure had revealed an individual initiative and adaptability that made the American airborne force something that its opponents could not adequately plan against, because the assumption that scattered drops were ineffective was wrong. Because scattered American paratroopers were not confused and helpless but dangerous in the specific way that trained soldiers with weapons and initiative who appear from unexpected directions are always dangerous. General Matthew Ridgway, commanding the 82nd Airborne Division, drew from the Sicily experience the tactical lessons that would shape American airborne doctrine for the rest of the war. Among those lessons was a specific recognition of what had happened on the night of July 9th, that the scatter which had prevented the execution of the planned operation had produced an unplanned but genuine tactical effect that had contributed to the success of the overall invasion. The lesson was not that scatter was desirable. The lesson was that paratroopers needed to be trained to be effective regardless of whether the drop went according to plan, because the drop was almost never going to go entirely according to plan, and the force that could accomplish something useful even when everything went wrong was a more valuable force than the force that could only execute the specific plan it had rehearsed. American airborne doctrine after Sicily was built around this understanding. The training programs at the airborne schools were redesigned to emphasize individual initiative and small unit decision-making rather than adherence to a predetermined plan. The after-action assessments that followed each subsequent airborne operation were focused on what individual paratroopers had done when separated from their units, rather than solely on the performance of units as a whole. The men who jumped into Normandy on June 6, 1944 were better prepared for the scatter that D-Day produced, which was at least as severe as the scatter that had plagued the Sicily operation, because they had been trained on the understanding that scatter was a given and individual effectiveness was the requirement. They scattered. And then they fought. And then Normandy was secured. It started in Sicily, in the olive groves and the farmyards where American paratroopers who had landed alone in the dark decided that being alone in the dark was not sufficient reason to stop fighting. It was not sufficient reason. It has never been sufficient reason for American paratroopers. That was the Sicily drop. That was what 5,300 paratroopers scattered across 60 miles of enemy territory in the first hours of the first major American airborne operation contributed to the history of the war. They showed up. They were in the wrong place. They fought anyway. That was always going to be enough.